Very good evening to everyone, respected Madam Chairperson and my worthy opponents. The topic placed before today's August House reads that this House supports the rise of China, and being the lead speaker of the proposition, I find it my duty to prove to you how true and valid today's motion really is and why we, as a global responsible citizen, should promote the rise of China. Now, firstly, as the duty of the lead speaker of the proposition, I will lay down what my constructives of my argument are, and I'm going to tell you what I will talk about and what my second speaker will talk about. So at the very outset, I will say that I will address the positive impact of China's rise via its political and economical policies, while my second speaker will elaborate on the internal policies of China that will prove to you why we as a responsible global citizen must support the rise of China. Now, I will address China's global contributions via the economical and political policies. Firstly, the economic policies. We must remember that when we talk of China, we're not talking about just 20% of the world. Now, China has 1.3 billion people, but what China's economic policies do is that they affect way more than 20% of the world. They affect 50% of the world through the trade investments that they have in countries like Brazil, India, Singapore, Vietnam, and Argentina. Just a minute. The rise of China is going to keep economic prosperity for not just China but a lot of other countries. Now, as of now, Brazil is the biggest trade investor. China is the biggest trade investor in Brazil of these nations, and this shows how China has actually gone ahead to help the underdeveloped nations. And as a responsible country of the world, it is required that for a country of such high stature to do so. China sets a perfect example of what a country should do when we talk about China. We are dealing with spreading this benevolent ideology. Now, another important part of my argument, I will talk about China's political policies and how they actually help combat the Western liberal democracy that the United States puts forth. Now, today when we see the world, we are shocked to see that there is absolute takeover by the Western media. Today when we see English media, print, and the TV shows, the news channels as well as the internet, they are clogged by China, the United States propaganda. And what this does is they have promoted a very picturesque and a very nice image of their Western liberal democracy, which apparently focuses a lot on human rights and individuality, while on the other hand, what they're actually doing is fostering capitalist ideology in the world. Which is why I think that when China comes up and talks to you, yes?
What do you exactly mean by capitalist ideology?
Okay, when I talk about capitalist ideologies, I refer to the many ventures that the United States have taken in different countries around the world. I refer to Libya, I refer to Syria, and I refer to Iraq. When I talk about capitalism, the basic ideology behind capitalism is to make sure that a single person has the right to avail of as many resources and as much wealth as is possible. And this is exactly what the United States have done. They have repeatedly gone on and on, invading into different countries and actually destroyed their territorial sovereignty. And this leaves them with very little room to this leaves those countries with very little room to repair themselves. Now, what China, on the other hand, has done is that they have entered into trade relations with these very nations so as to help repair them and actually do correct the wrongs that the United States and other countries of the Western bloc of the nation has done. Now, to address China's positive political issues, in a world which is so muddled up with the Western liberal democracies, I spoke to you about the monopoly over the media houses and the English print by the United States, and I firmly believe that this needs to be checked. Just because Western liberal democracy is all that we see does not mean that it is in a world we have to blindly follow it. What USA promotes, as I told you, is a very capitalist country that, yes?
Aren't these values actually way better than the values that China is promoting at the moment?
Okay, thank you for bringing up that point. Now I'll try my best to prove to you why the values that we think that the United States promotes as better is actually not. I spoke to you about United States' capitalist tendencies and how they actually promote themselves with the monopoly over the news channels as to why they are better, and that is all we as countries from Europe and Asia have been exposed to. But when we actually analyze what China's political and economic policies are, they are what is known as socialism. When Karl Marx wrote about socialism and what Mao Zedong spread in China through socialism is that the state is that every individual of the country, every individual in the country has a right to gain a livelihood, and we can see that China has actually done this in many numerous ways. One and the most important of which is taking 500 million people in their country out of poverty, and it's really interesting to see that China has not just completely has not restricted itself to helping people only inside its country, but also outside its country. While I explained, on the other hand, what the United States has done is given us the garb of capitalism to actually further its own economic interests. Now, with reference to this, I will talk to you about the Syrian civil war. Now, what has happened in the Syrian civil war is that Bashar al-Assad, who is claimed by the United States to be a tyrannical government, has actually been attacked by rebels all across the region, the very volatile Middle East. But what the United States is doing, as it has done in 2003 with Iraq, is that it has proposed to bomb the area and remove this government which has been democratically elected. Now what China has done is that every other nation in the world, because it can see that there is not too much economic prosperity to be gained from such a volatile region, has backed away. But in order to protect the economy of the Syrian citizens, the Chinese have not removed their 99% oil stakes that they have in the region, and they have continued to foster trade relations in such a volatile region. Yes, ma'am?
Well, isn't China not like having human rights and so on? Isn't that like the most important thing we have to think about at the moment?
Okay, now thank you for bringing that up, because what I agree that over the last 50 years, China has not had the best human rights record. But what you also must note that since the 1995, this rise has only gone up. Every year, the United Nations every country in the United Nations submits what is known as a white report to the United Nations, which is a complete list of the human rights violations committed in that country, which has been overlooked by United Nations officials. Now, over the last 15 years, there has been a very positive, 20 years, there has been a very positive trend that we have seen in the decrease in human rights violations. Now, the reason China has had human rights violations is because in order to enforce this socialism, they had to curb down some of the individual liberties of its citizens. And after identifying the problems it has had in their economic and political policies, they've moved ahead and tried to curb that. So what we're not essentially, as the proposition, saying that China is the best government. But remember that this topic talks about the rise of China, whether we as a responsible global citizen should support or not support the rise of China. And seeing the positive trends that China has had over the many years, over the last 20 years, we see it's evidence enough to promote the rise of a growing superpower, which will not only help 20% of the world, but will actually help 50% of the world. With this, I'd like to rest my case. Thank you.
What the side proposition claims is positive regarding this topic is actually negative. That is what I'm going to show you during my speech, and my two second speakers are going to continue showing. So I'll first refute what they stated in their two substantive points, and then I'll introduce my third point. So let's begin. They stated that the rise of China should be supported because China has some good economic policies, because China invests in developing countries. But what we need to note is that China often there are two problems with China's investment. Firstly, if the rise of China means that because China is currently investing in countries without regards to what the policies of the people in power are. So that means that China will continue to invest in states that the repressive regimes are in. That means that China will continue to invest in countries where there are a lot of human rights violations. That means that China is not fulfilling its role in trying to persuade all countries possible to respect human rights. Also, what's bad about China's investment in those countries is that it doesn't have as its aim to make sure that those countries are independent. So what China does is invest in those countries in that way that it makes them dependent on them, and that it makes them a source of cheap labor, a source of cheap labor, and because a lot of those countries have really bad labor standards. So that means that all Chinese companies only want to make profits, and they do not, because development of countries is important, and we need all countries to be developed. But what China is doing by its investing is actually promoting some bad repressive regimes and hindering the independent development of China, what some other states are doing. So we need investment, but not the investment in the way China does it. No, thank you. So, what we disagree the most on is the second part of their speech, which says political policies. They attribute spreading some, for example, Syrian civil war or Libyan war to capitalist ideologies. We regret the fact that those wars happen, but they are not a product of capitalist ideology. What we need to make sure is that what we need to state is that countries want to spread their influence. But what we are going to show is that Western values, respecting democracy, respecting human rights, and respecting individual liberties is something that should be supported. And that's why if China rises, that is going to be further stated in the second point my second speaker will make. No, thank you. They're actually making those countries dependent on them, and then those countries won't condemn violations of Chinese human rights. That has already been happening. What we need to state is that we can support a state where citizens don't democratically elect their government. We can support a state where there is a wide range of human rights violations. We can support a state where 70% of death penalties have been executed. We can support a state that is a threat to other countries. We can support the state that is actually no, thank you. We can support the state that is restricting individual freedoms, and regarding they have tried to show that there is a positive trend. However, that's not true. Chinese government has never been more oppressive to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and they have never been more oppressive to Tibetan independence movements. 2 months ago, Chinese authorities put 200 lawyers and human rights activists in custody. So we cannot claim that there is a positive trend. Actually, it is worsening in some regards, because China's economic development has been based on exploiting labor, has been based on cheap labor, on making low labor standards so that profits can be made, and that is not something we should support.
Okay, so in your speech you spoke about how there is no positive trend, but don't you think that the United Nations report is a more credible source than a newspaper report about 200 human rights activists, which you might have gotten from a Westernly doctored media report?
That is also a problem, because Western propaganda may mean that Western propaganda, regardless of whether it exists or not, that can be put aside. What we need to look at now is how a country is behaving towards its citizens, and if it's restricting their individual liberties in order to achieve some socialist goals, that's not great. That's not good. We should not support a country that rises on those principles. So let me start with my first substantial point. No, thank you. That means that the rise of China degrades the level of global stability. First, I'm going to show that China may infringe upon the sovereignty of other countries, which is bad. China has 6 unresolved territorial disputes. It claims it possesses territories that belong to other states because of possible natural resources or very strategically important position of some of those areas. Example of these are Senkaku Islands, Spratly Islands. So tensions in these areas have been steadily increasing. For example, satellite images have revealed China is building artificial islands with military bases in other states' marine territories in international waters. Chinese government has also been increasing its military budget and is approaching the time when it will be strong enough to successfully military pursue its interests. We can remember that they stated that US intervention was very bad and that we should not support US and Western media, but at the same time they're actually supporting a country that is doing the same thing that they portray as negative, and is doing that more dangerously and more directly. For example, there's also an additional contributor to that is that China is steadily increasing its investment in military, and there's one more example that there have been some that China wants to divert some rivers into the Yellow River because it is drying out, and by that ruin the agriculture of other countries near it. China can do that today, but once it comes to a certain point militarily, it will be in the position to do it, and that's question. No, thank you. And that's very bad because that will destroy national sovereignty of some other states. And what's even more problematic is that we will have more unstable world because US is currently involved in some of these disputes. Because China's primarily military goal in the Pacific is to push the US away from the coast. And when looking at countries China has disputes with, such as for example Japan, and in general US is often more on China's opponent sides. That significantly increases the risk of direct conflict and even more of an indirect one, for example proxy wars or China being in war with US allies. That means that the US won't watch peacefully but will either side with China's opponent or will even become militarily offensive. Even if they have showed us all the benefits, what the most significant thing is this: we will have a more unstable world, and that is basically the worst thing we can currently have, because we have shown that the risk of conflict significantly increases, and conflict is bad because people die, people feel insecure, cooperation between countries fails, both economic and both political, economy slows down, and basically whatever they state, as we have showed this big risk, we have shown that what will happen is something much more bad than eventual economic investment in Brazil or fact that China is giving humanitarian aid in Syria. No, thank you. So let me sum this all up. Firstly, we have shown that China's rise in economic policies means that bad economic policies will be spread, and that what they are actually against some US military involvement, that China is even worse in those aspects, so that it follows that they should not support the rise of China, and there is kind of a contradiction there. And we have shown that we will have a more unstable world as China is trying to spread its sphere of influence, thereby conflicting with US spheres of influence, and that is something which that's not supported. Thank you.
The first speaker of side opposition began with a very blunt statement about how we as side proposition have a burden to prove that China has to economically outdo all expectations, and secondly, about how simply proving economically that China is the best decision for the world is not good enough, and we would have to do so on political, military, social and religious grounds. Respected Madam Chairperson, honourable members of the opposition. Today I feel it is my duty to prove to you the validity of the motion. This House supports the rise of China. Coming very first to the refutations I have, the rebuttals I have to the first speaker of side opposition. Speaker Sir pointed out that China has a history of investing in countries which have a bad record in terms of disturbed governments. Madam Chairperson, I feel it's my duty here to point out what their goal with investing in Syria is. You see, with investing in Syria, China is essentially, I beg your pardon, with going into Syria, China's primary concern is its oil fields. 99.9% of oil fields in Syria are controlled by Chinese. And in this situation, you must understand that China has not offered any hostile support to Syria. Rather to the Bashar al-Assad government, rather their support is of the nature in order to secure and proclaim their oil fields. Once again, putting forward the image of China as a country of traders, a country looking out for its own trade and not promoting hostility. Secondly, I feel it's my need to bring forward before this House the African example, where where investments from China have led to a 19% growth in GDP and a mass reduction of human rights violations that were previously taking place in Africa. Further, I feel it is my duty to point out to you that they have blatantly ignored the Brazilian and Indian investments of China, which are once again democratic governments and are very stable governments. Further, I feel the need to bring to your notice their continuous mention about human rights violations. Here, I would like to allude to my point about the rise of China. You see, through this rise of China over the last decade or so, these human rights violations have been brought before the United Nations, as my first speaker pointed out through the White Report, and I once again bring forward as a refutation. The White Report allows the United Nations to keep track of this. It allows China to become part of that global village. It allows China to become part of globalization as it counters this human rights violation. Further, I feel the need to point out to you, Madam Chairperson, the logical gap in their argument. They talk about the increase in China's military and they directly link it with intervention. I talk to you about China's non-intervention policy. How do they justify that? Is China's increase in military directly proportional to its intervention? With this, I come to my constructives, Madam Chairperson. My first speaker has highlighted to you China's direct involvement with nations outside itself and how that promotes it as a responsible member of the world community. I feel the need to highlight to you China itself and its indirect role in the world. Here, I would like to point out to you that as a matter of fact, China has a growth rate of over 8% for the last 20 years on an average. And last year, with a 7% growth rate, it had the lowest growth rate in 25 years. Further, I feel the need to point out to you that it is the second largest economy with maximum trade relations, a definite requirement in a world leader, in a superpower. After that, I feel the need to point out to you that they have recovered from the crash of 2014. Now, the crash of 2014 may be maligned by my opponents to represent something negative in their economy. What I feel is that this crash represents how China stands as a stable economy. You see, we talk about the American crash, we talk about the crash in Greece, but do we ever talk about the crash in China? It's because of the way the Chinese economy dealt with it, further reducing the impact of the crash in European nations as well as Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel the need to point out to you the China internal policy on a political level. Now, my opponents have come up here and built before you an image of China as a very hostile nation internally. As a nation that does not allow opposing views, as a nation that does not allow protests.
Sir,
let me point out to you, yes sir.
You believe government leaders should be democratically elected?
Sir, this is a point that my first speaker has already addressed. I do not stand here as a proponent of democracy or any other form of government. Rather, he has addressed you about how the world needs a bipolar system. You see, understand that different political systems come together to produce the world we need. And by talking to you about how the rise of China would lead to bipolar systems, we are talking about a better world. We are talking about a world with different political views. And I think that is something the world needs today. So coming back to my point about protests, today China has 300 to 500 protests a day. It has tens of thousands of protesters in these protests, which once again shows us how the government is changing day by day, how the government is being exposed to other views, how the government is accepted as a consequence of this rise. Further, I would like to point out to you that people today are ready to revolt against anything, be it forced eviction or arbitrary detention. No, sir. After that, I'd like to address you about the Hukao system. Now, Madam Chairperson, I'd like to draw your attention to this. This is something where the internal immigrants of China, as part of this Hukao system, were not offered jobs and employment in the past. Today, China has completely abolished the system as a consequence of suggestions made by other more peaceful nations, Switzerland and New Zealand included, which once again goes to show us how Chinese government is undertaking policy measures, is refining their policy measures as a result of opposing views. There was a stage where internet restrictions were at a stage where words like human rights, activism, amnesty, freedom were not accepted in China. But today, these internet restrictions are being removed and China is reaching a stage where Facebook, Twitter and various other social networking sites are being freely made available to their people. Now, why is this important? You see, China itself is important because of something called brain drain. Chinese people are going all over the world and influencing economies, they're influencing political systems, they're influencing nations at large. These people are growing within a nation which is more accepting, a nation which is broader in its political views, and that is something that is going to influence the world through brain drain itself. Bill Clinton, ladies and gentlemen, once said, "The richer China gets, the less of a threat it becomes." It is with this statement that I'd like to introduce to you my second argument, the rise of China and the positive impacts this rise itself will generate. You see, out of the top 23 richest countries in the world, there are only 2 countries today, ladies and gentlemen, only 2 countries today which are involved in conflict. These being the United States of America and the United Kingdom. So my point here is that the richer the country gets, the less is its need to acquire resources. And thus, the less is its hostility. You see, China today is making changes as a consequence of its growing economy, as a consequence of its refining nation. The one-child policy is being abolished. My friends here in the opposition spoke about the Yellow River and its pollution. I talked to you today about how China is taking up 25,164 cases and putting bans on 9,325 companies as a result of its Anti-Pollution and the Environmental Protection Act, or the EPA. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is simple. It is the fact that a world leader needs to offer a moral precedence. A world leader needs to set an example. China, through its rise, as well as through the former points which were positive in its nature, is setting this example. It is making the reforms that it previously did not have in its military and political systems, and it continues to stand as a very strong economic power, a very strong trade partner, and a very strong nation. Thank you.
It is better to have a unipolar world than a bipolar when China is one of the superpowers. Good day everyone, my name is Maya and today I'm going to be the second speaker of the opposition. The second speaker of the proposition today gave us 4 points I would like to refer to today, and also carried out his second substantive, which I'm also going to refer to later. First of all, he says that investing in Syria gives China all control, and that China also invests in Africa and other countries which are similar to Syria and other African countries. So what I want to show you is that that is an already problematic territory. And once that China invests in these countries, it is going to spread its bad values, which are extremely bad for today's society. No, thank you. So that I'm going to show you later throughout my second substantive. Their third point today was military rise doesn't mean intervention, but we are talking about the country that violates human rights and promotes bad values. So our question is not why would it make any sort of intervention, but why not? Because if a country has money, if it has a strong military force, and if it has the power to make any sort of a military intervention, then the question why is not the right question, it's the why not. Because China will always, no thank you, want more power, and China will always make intervention. On to the fourth point that their second speaker carried out, which is we need bipolarity. Just as I said at the beginning of my speech, we want it is better to have a unipolar world than a bipolar world when one of the superpowers is China. Why? Because China is spreading bad values. China violates human rights. China promotes these bad values, and she is actually spreading them on other countries and other cultures, which is a bad thing. No, thank you. All of these things we are going to show you throughout our second substantive. Now, to refer to their second substantive, which says that UK and US are the only ones in conflict. Just as they said, US is currently spreading its values. What they said is the richer it is, the more peaceful. But this is not true, because the power considers intervention. And we want to show you that it is a bad thing that China rises. Why? Because then it will lead to China's military rising, it will lead to China having more and more money that she can invest in actually making all of these interventions go on.
Ma'am, first you're saying that China's military rise is not a good thing because it will invade other countries. On the other hand, you're saying why is China not intervening in other countries? Can you please make your stance clear, because you're just promoting what we are saying?
No, I'm actually telling you that it is a bad thing that China makes any sort of intervention in other countries. Therefore, I'm showing you that we do not want China to spread its values because we support human rights. We want that human rights are appreciated everywhere, because that is actually the base of each and every society. What we need human rights. We need a society where each and every human is appreciated and where each and every human has a right to stand out and to speak. And China is what actually makes the problem here. China is the one spreading the bad values onto other countries, and China is the one saying no to human rights. So, to carry out my second substantive, which is spreading bad values. The rise of China will lead to China spreading bad values because a country wants to increase and maintain political, economic and military influence over other countries. When maintaining influence, it is important that a powerful country and other countries share the same goals and views on same political matters. That extends the large power sphere influence, which is important to interior power, as it helps in defend itself and gain stronger stay in the international community. Smaller powers accept the ideology of larger powers because to them that means protection and economic growth, which means that these smaller countries that are currently unstable are going to say yes to these bad values just because China is a superpower and just because China says it's okay, and that is a bad thing. The government in China,
Yes.
no thank you. The government in China censors the press, the internet and all the print publications, academic research and justifies human rights abuses as necessary to preserve so-called social stability. It carries out involuntary population, relocation and rehousing on a massive scale and enforces highly representative policies in ethnic minority areas, just like Tibet, Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. Only 2 months ago, Chinese government took 200 lawyers and human rights activists into custody. China executes 1,700 people a year, which counts for over 70% of world executions. Also, China has, no thank you, bad labor standards. Although China has been rising, it has been increasing the power for the security apparatus, and China has no democracy. And that means that it places significant restrictions to individual rights and freedom of expression, which I strictly showed you how important they are in each and every society. Because a society with no human rights, a society where each and every man has no thank you, has no right to stand out and to speak, or to be equal as every other human being in that country and that society, is not a good society.
Again,
Go ahead.
ma'am, you continuously talk about human rights violations, but you have to understand that the crux of the opposition's argument which you are countering is about how human rights violations are going down with their rise. Could you please comment on that?
What I'm showing you is that China already violates human rights, and China currently, as rises, becomes a big military and economic force. And by having power, China has power to spread these bad values to other countries, which is a very bad thing, because then, when we have an unstable country, we have a country that says yes to these things, and these are the bad things for each society. China today promotes its bad values because China is bound in very close connection to some of its neighbors and a lot of developing countries such as African countries, Caribbean and Angola or Sudan. Also, the PR of China inwardly votes against condemning violation of human rights in the UN General Assembly. African and Latin American countries with growing trade ties with China actually have begun to abstain or vote against resolutions. All that I've showed you is that China promotes bad values, and China is spreading these bad values to other countries, and that is bad because it actually makes a bad society and it's not a good thing, which is why we shouldn't support the rise of China. Thank you.
Very good evening to all of you present here. As the third speaker of the proposition, it is my duty to constructively break down the argument of the opposition. Now, I would like to start by highlighting what the clash of today's debate is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, today's debate has essentially been about how China is violating the human rights of its people. Now, the crux of the proposition's arguments lie on how today, as we stand, the level of human rights violation has severely gone down. In the due course of my speech, I will be providing you with certain examples to support this. Which brings me to my first point. The first speaker of the proposition came up and stated that there are problems with China's investments. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we must understand is that there is a major difference between investing in a country and infiltrating a country. Now, when China is essentially investing in a country, it is not only trying to make its economy better, it is also trying to make the economy of the other country better. I will provide you with an example of what they are doing in Africa. Today, essentially, China is investing in Africa and they are trying to build schools and hospitals and many other projects in Africa. This in turn is resulting in the betterment of the African infrastructure and also is helping China's economic condition, which is a win-win situation for both these nations. Now, the second point I'd like to address is what the first speaker of the proposition came and said. No, thank you. She came and stated that we need democratic and westernized policies. As my first and second speakers have very clearly stated, is that today we are in need of a bipolar world. We need a communist superpower to tackle a democratic superpower. No, thank you. That exists in today's world. Now, the opposition also came and stated about how we are going to have a more unstable world if China grows into a superpower. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we must understand is that China, which accounts to 20% of the population of the world, which in turn affects 50% of the world's economy, is providing more stability to the world's economy and is in no way going to bring that down. And in turn, with the examples that my second speaker has provided you with, we have shown you very constructively how China supports and is the standing pillar of the other economies of its neighboring countries. Now, another point that the opposition brought up was the military. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that China spends 1.4% of its annual income on making its military better. Now, I tell you, they do so for the betterment and safeguarding and saving the other neighboring countries from... Yes, ma'am.
How can you guarantee that China is not going to make any sort of an intervention if it has such a strong military?
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, my point out here is telling you that today when China is investing in a country, its goals are different from it infiltrating into a country. I know you all are hell-bent and stuck upon the examples that you all have provided about it infiltrating into Tibet. But what you must understand, ladies and gentlemen, is that they did so a very long time back and things have been changing. They are changing their political viewpoints. Now, in the case of the United States, they went and changed the political system in Africa, whereas China has never done so. Now, I'd like to talk to you about how China has actually become more lenient when it comes to the human rights. Firstly, they have abolished the system of arbitrary detention. Secondly, they have made improvements in jobs for internal migrants, which wasn't possible earlier. Thirdly, they have abolished discrimination against children with disabilities. And fourthly, they have demolished the one-child policy.
Sir,
yes.
But does that guarantee that China will promote some of the core human rights, such as right to vote, right to freedom of speech, rights and other individual rights?
Thank you for your question, sir. Sir, what I essentially mean by my argument today is that when China, a country which has essentially started changing in this decade, they are slowly moving into a phase where they are adopting policies in a small way, yes, but they are adopting policies to change the human rights policies right now, and they are eventually going to give more and more rights to the people, which will eventually lead to it becoming a superpower and it serving as a more productive deal for the entire world. Now, today, the opposition has completely built their argument on the basis of what the Western media is portraying the current scenario in China. Ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that the people in China are enjoying every aspect of their life. They are doing what normal people of the rest of the world do. And we need to understand that the government and the policies are changing. Now, this brings me to the point where the second speaker came and spoke about bad values. Now, I need to tell you that bad values, or rather spreading bad values or cultures, do not necessarily have to mean that they are bad because they are different from what the US adopts. We need to understand that the rise of the East and Eastern culture, so many years after the brutalities of the Western colonialism, is far overdue. China is a support system for many Eastern civilizations and cultures. There are a lot of religious conventions, there are a lot of ancient monasteries which are being revived, and a bunch of systems of great cultural value to the world that should be preserved and encouraged, which are being done by China. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to bring to your notice that today China agrees and provides free education up to the 8th grade. Now, this provides us with a statistic that today they are caring about their people. Today they are caring about the people by increasing the military strength and safeguarding them. They are caring about the neighboring states by trying... No, thank you. Today they are increasing the military strength and they are protecting their neighbors from exploitation of other bigger countries. Now this brings me to my last point. We need to understand that when we talk about the rise in China, we essentially mean a peaceful rise in China. A rise that is not aggressive, but which seeks to expand with its own problems and not problems with the neighbor. Now, or rather, the opposition brought up the environmental factor to this debate, ladies and gentlemen. My second speaker came up here and showed you how China is already adopting policies which will change the course of its environmental future. Now, what China has essentially done is that they have adopted a new law which is slowly making the condition of the environment better in the world and in China. This brings me to the end of my speech. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody, I'm Carlo, I'm the third speaker of the proposition in this debate, and I will try to prove the opposition of the debate, and I will try to prove you how actually you are very wrong, how you are actually quite differently understanding what China is, and how we are actually right in stating that China is oppressive and that it violates human rights. Well, to start off, I will touch on the unipolar thingy that we were all arguing about. So what I want to state here is that unipolar world is better than the bipolar, especially if one of the superpowers is China. Because China violates human rights, China oppresses people, China does not respect the democratic values that this world has too. China is still doing killing prisoners. There is still death penalty available in China, and it is responsible for the 70% of the whole death penalty in the world. Not just that, it violates basic human worker rights, it abuses children in their work, and also, the most importantly, it promotes its bad values into the country. In the countries, it is no thank you. In the countries, it is investing, and it is actually in a trade deal. Okay, so to begin off, you were stating how US is rich, and that is why they are promoting their bad values, which are basically a capitalist ideology, which is bad. But you haven't proven to us at any given moment of this debate why is that capitalist ideology exactly bad. And why is that capitalist ideology making our world a worse place than China's ideology, for example? No, thank you. Okay, you were saying how you want that bipolar system, and you were, in a way, actually condemning democracy. What I have to tell you is that democracy is one of our basic, no thank you, is one of our basic human values. And you stated in your last speech how it doesn't mean it is bad if the system is different. It doesn't mean that that system is bad. But we have agreed for a reason on our basic human rights that are present in the Western world, that are present in the Euro. We have agreed that that is the best system which will conserve our humanity at best. No, thank you. Human rights are here for a reason. And China does not respect our human rights. We can't condemn it for being wrong because it is not respecting what we are, and that is people, that we deserve, that we have a right to live, that we have a right to work safely, and that we have a right to breathe fresh air every day.
So you spoke about how we as a world should condemn China for human rights violations, and I agree to that. But don't you think the very fact that they have also understood that the human rights violations are bad and they're reducing it, and there's a positive trend regarding human rights violations, is reason enough to believe that we should propagate the rise of China?
Okay, thank you. What I'm actually trying to prove here, that with the rise of China, those human rights will not better in any way. Those human rights, it will promote those bad human rights that it has right now and spread it all over the world. The human rights are not getting better. Human rights in China are still violated. It is, not to mention, it's oppressing military policy. It is, you said how it is saving some countries and it is defending them. How is China defending those countries if it has invasive military policy to, for example, in the South China Sea and so on. Also to refer to those countries where it is spreading its bad values, I want to say how, for example, we have a country with bad education, for example, a country somewhere in Africa with malaria problems and world hunger still present there? Well, sure, China helps it a bit by bettering its somehow economy and providing some medications for malaria, and that makes those countries dependent on China. Those countries those countries are dependent on China. Those countries are dependent on China in a way that they cannot function without its help. China is, no thank you, and therefore China is promoting its bad values to those countries, because countries cannot be in a good trade partnership if their ideologies and if their goals are the same. So, for example, we have every year there is a General Assembly in the United Nations on country-specific human rights and their respect. And China, for example, doesn't sign those treaties and those treaties. No, thank you. China votes against. For example, we had Costa Rica, which usually voted for, and as its late partnership with China, it is now voting against. So we can see that basically China truly is promoting, through dependency of developing states, its bad values. No, thank you. So Costa Rica, it's a state with a long-lasting tradition of promoting human rights, and it started siding with China on resolutions against human rights. Okay, so China is economically powerful, and small countries give in to its influence because China is rising. Its economy surely is rising, and that is why those countries see the opportunity, and go to China and not ask for help, but China gives them help, and they are very, let's say, liberal in that. They accept their help, but to get their help, they have to side with China's ideology. They have to side with China's goal. They have to do the same thing that China does and not respect human rights. Because we do not support anything that helps spreading bad values, and by that we mean breaking democracy. No, thank you. Infringing upon human rights in individuals with no governmental protection, and breaking freedoms with no justification or legal conditions, and because China is doing exactly that, and by rising is making other countries to act the same. We do not support the rise of China because of that. Because smaller countries are dependent on that, and because of that, they have to side with China's bad ideology, and that is why China promotes its bad values. And we condemn that. We condemn China's bad values. We say no, democracy is good. No, Western world is much more supported by us. So that thing, Western world is much more supported by us because it has good values. It has values of human rights, which are there for a reason. To preserve our humanity, to give us life, to give us the freedom to work safely, for example. And China does not do that, and that is why we condemn it, and that is why we condemn its spread of bad values throughout the world. Okay, so basically, what I said in my speech is that the proposition in this debate hasn't proved us at any moment that China is not spreading its bad values, and that China doesn't have those bad values. And I think we have actually proven, and that is why I ask you to vote for us, because we have actually proven better that China, by dependency of developing states, is spreading those bad values. And also, we have proven how bipolar world would not be good, because there would be, first of all, conflict in those two very different ideologies, and China's oppressive military policies on the other countries. Thank you very much.
So what I'm going to show in this reply speech is how rise of China affects every stakeholder negatively, and I'm going to show you that through 4 separate points, which are all included in the rise of China. First, we have the military rise. We agree it is truth that China is investing more in military. And let me just point this out. Firstly, the side proposition said that US intervenes in Syria because it can and because it is rich. Later on, they said that China won't intervene because the richer the country is, the more peaceful it is. That is an obvious contradiction. And what is more likely? Of course, it's more likely that the China will, as US, intervene. And let's keep in mind this. US foreign policy is not the same thing as Western principle of human rights. proposition has made an enormous mistake by equating those two terms. We as side opposition have shown that we uphold the Western principle of human rights, but we can also be skeptical of US foreign policy. That is, those two terms are not the same. And so what's likely to happen with China's military rise? For example, if I'm a Taiwanese citizen, my right to live in a country I want to live in will be restricted because China will have the means to militarily invade my country. All other people will live in globally unstable world. I may live in a globally unstable world because China and the US might wage proxy wars just because they're in some kind of an economic competition. And let's not equate US foreign policy with principle of human rights, because we have always shown that we are supporting human rights core values such as democracy, freedom of speech, and we have never claimed that US intervention in Syria or Libya was a good thing, which basically was the assumption this side proposition had. The second aspect is, for example, China extending the power of security apparatus. Okay, so what side proposition was trying to tell is, okay, we have better healthcare, we have better education. That is true, but that pales in comparison when we take into considerations that minorities' rights have been in a decrease. When we take into account that human rights activists have never been treated more badly, that security apparatus has so much power, and that main rights such as voting, freedom of speech, freedom of information are not upheld, and these rights are more important than those they claim China has been improving. The third thing that is bound to happen is the spread of values. We have showed, for example, at Costa Rica and a lot of African countries that have been supporting a resolution condemning human rights, that presented an incentive, an international pressure for China to stop to maybe do something in the direction of promoting human rights. But however, they will not do that because that part of international pressure has been lost. That means that countries China invests in will be more likely to side with their principle of, okay, we may restrict your rights, we may not treat you fairly, we may exploit your labor, but just because we'll have those 0.2% of GDP rising. So that's something very bad. Every citizen of a country China is investing in is in that danger, that China's values will spread, and also China's method of production. It will remain the same. Their basic goal is...
20 seconds.
Their basic goal is that we may restrict your freedom of speech because we'll get 0.2% of GDP higher, as long as the outcome is the income. But that is not what we should be. Supporting. These things I have shown you will negatively affect the world, all separate stakeholders, and therefore China's rights should not be supported. Thank you.
So thank you to both sides for a very entertaining debate. So I'm going to point out some phrases that the proposition and the opposition have used. Starting with the opposition, it might, we may, more likely, bound to happen, and might. And on the other hand, what the proposition has said is that we can see there is a positive tendency, there is a positive trend, and this is going to happen because there is evidence. The point that I'm trying to prove here is that what the proposition has done today is that for every fact that it has mentioned, it has accounted for it with evidence. It has said that this is a trend that we are seeing, and because there is evidence to a trend, we can see that the future of China is positive, and hence we as a responsible government, as a responsible world citizen, should promote the rise of China. While what the opposition has done is, for example, to take one incident, it has said that because the Taiwanese citizens are present in such a volatile region, that there might be a proxy war between the United States and the China, though there has never actually been over the last 60 years any sort of military engagement between the United States and China. Now, actually going over what each speaker over the debate has said, I started my speech talking about the very the global policies that the Chinese have introduced, and how they are very different and very unique from what they used to propose 50 years ago, and how they are actually moving towards a brighter future. The second speaker of my the second speaker of the proposition again spoke about how it is important to see that the internal policies within China, which were subject to a lot of United States condemnation and even the United Nations condemnations, China as a responsible government has recognized these very flaws and is well on its way to recover from these flaws and actually move towards a brighter brighter future for not just its citizens but also citizens around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we have spoken about the economic policies, the political policies, and the social policies that China has actually refurbished over the years. And from this trend, we can see that China is on the rise, and hence we should support the rise of China. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you an analogy. Let's take the situation of a little girl in China today. Today, when she is born in China, she's in a world which is free from the one-child policy. She is born in a world which is finally free of the Chinese foot-breaking tradition. She is free from the fact that she cannot immigrate into another region internally without any pay. So we can see that the future for this girl will be bright, provided that China continues to be on the rise that it is. But on the other hand, if we further proving my point, I give you the situation of a boy in Syria. A boy in Syria right now is struck with the civil war. But with what China is trying to do using its oil stakes in the Syrian companies is that it is trying to provide that economic safeguard and security to those Syrian citizens who don't have anything to do with the war. Ladies and gentlemen, what we can see is what my third speaker pointed out is that there is a very big difference between investing in a country and infiltrating in a country. What the United States has done it is tried to infiltrate in Iraq, it has tried to infiltrate in Libya. But what China has simply done, it has invested in Syria to continuously stay away from the hostility in the nation and only to provide economic safeguards to the people present there. Ladies and gentlemen, when we actually recapitulate over the debate, we can see that side proposition has constantly focused on the things that have been done, while the side opposition has tried to say, using just fake rhetoric and no substantial argument, that this is something that might happen. And they have used the garb of Western capitalism to promote the fact that we are all exposed to Western capitalist ideologies, that Western capital ideologies, just because they think so, is somehow superior to Chinese communist ideologies. And we as the proposition are not arguing whether the Western capitalism is better or the Chinese communism or socialism is better. All we are saying is that a responsible citizen, it is our duty to note that China, which has been suffering from a lot of missed policies over the last 50 years, has actually recognized its flaws and is moving towards a brighter future. And hence, this is reason enough, this is substantial reason to say that China needs to rise, and we as a global citizen should support the rise of China. With this, I'd like to conclude.